Hey everyone, I know I'm just a person sharing some unsettling stories, but if you're enjoying the creepy vibes, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe before we dive in. Today's story is a real wild one. It's about a seemingly perfect Tinder date that took a chilling turn, leaving the person wondering if they were ever really talking to who they thought they were. Seriously, this one will make you question your next swipe. Let's get into it. So this story happened to a friend of a friend. We'll call her Emily. Now, Emily wasn't someone who typically got caught up in online dating. She had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, and for the first time in years, she found herself single and unsure of how to navigate the modern dating world. It was all so new to her, swiping on profiles, messaging complete strangers. She figured it would be a good way to get back out there without diving into anything serious. At first, it was fun. Swiping through Tinder became her nightly ritual, especially when she was bored or couldn't sleep. She liked the control, deciding who she was interested in and chatting only when she felt like it. It gave her a sense of empowerment. But after a few casual conversations that went nowhere, she started feeling like maybe it wasn't for her. Then she matched with Chris. Now, Chris wasn't like the other guys she talked to. From his very first message, he seemed confident, but not cocky. He was charming in that effortless way that put her at ease. His profile was simple. No weird flexes, no red flags, just a regular guy with a nice smile and an easygoing vibe. He wrote in his bio that he loved hiking, cooking, and had a soft spot for animals. He seemed perfect. Their conversations flowed easily. He asked thoughtful questions, made her laugh, and never once did he push things too far. Emily felt like she could relax, like this was finally someone she could trust. He seemed safe. Over the course of a few days, they started talking every night. The more they chatted, the more she felt like she knew him. That excitement you get when you feel like someone actually gets you? Yeah, she had that with Chris. About a week into their conversation, he suggested they meet in person. He picked a restaurant downtown, this trendy little spot she'd been wanting to try for months. The place was pretty popular, always busy, and that made Emily feel more comfortable. After all, meeting someone from the internet for the first time can be nerve-wracking, and being in a crowded place gave her a sense of security. The night of the date, Emily felt that familiar mix of excitement and anxiety as she got ready. She took extra time choosing her outfit, making sure it was casual but cute. The whole time she was getting dressed, she kept replaying their conversations in her head, smiling to herself. This felt different, like it could actually lead to something. But still, there was that little voice in the back of her head, reminding her to be cautious. After all, you never really know someone until you meet them in person. She arrived a little early, as she often did on dates, just to get her bearings. She grabbed a seat at the bar while she waited for Chris, checking her phone and pretending not to feel as nervous as she was. After what felt like forever, Chris walked in, right on time. Her first thought? He looks exactly like his pictures. No catfishing here. He was just as handsome in person as he seemed online. He greeted her with a warm smile, and any remaining nerves she had melted away. They exchanged that slightly awkward small talk that always happens at the beginning of a first date. But soon the conversation started flowing, just like it had online. He was funny, charming, and attentive. He asked about her day, listened to her talk about her job, and even shared some funny stories from his own life. Everything felt normal. But as the evening went on, Emily started to notice something strange. Whenever she asked Chris anything personal, like what he did for work or where he grew up, he gave these vague, almost rehearsed answers. It wasn't that he was dodging her questions outright, but it was clear he wasn't giving her any real details. For example, when she asked where he was from, he just said, "Oh, I've moved around a lot," without ever mentioning any specific place. When she asked about his job, he said, "I do freelance work, mostly online stuff." But when she tried to dig a little deeper, he smoothly redirected the conversation back to her. At first, she didn't think much of it. Not everyone is super open on a first date, but the more he avoided answering, the more that nagging feeling in the pit of her stomach grew. Something wasn't quite right. Still, she brushed it off. The conversation was flowing, they were laughing, and everything felt fine. So why make a big deal out of it? After a couple of hours, the date came to an end. Chris offered to walk her to her car, And as they said their goodbyes, he gave her a warm, genuine smile. He even said he'd love to see her again sometime soon. They exchanged a quick hug, and as she drove home, Emily felt pretty good about the night. Sure, there were some weird moments, but overall, it had gone well. The next day, Emily did what so many of us do after a first date. She opened up Facebook and Instagram, curious to see if she could find more about Chris. Not in a stalkerish way, of course, just the usual post-date social media check. But when she typed his name into Facebook, she got nothing. No profile, no mutual friends, nothing. Okay, she thought, maybe he's just not on Facebook. Some people don't use social media, right? But when she tried Instagram, LinkedIn, even Twitter, there was still nothing. No trace of him anywhere. And that's when she started feeling that little ripple of anxiety. What if he had lied about his name? What if he wasn't who he said he was? Trying not to jump to conclusions, she decided to message him on Tinder, hoping to ease her worries. But when she opened the app, she felt her heart skip a beat. His profile was gone, completely disappeared, as if he'd never existed. Now, Emily was officially freaked out. She texted the number Chris had given her before the date, but every time she called, it went straight to voicemail. She sent a few texts asking if everything was okay, but they all went unanswered. Chris had vanished, just like his online profiles. At this point, Emily's mind was racing. Who was this guy? Had he given her a fake name? Was he some kind of scammer? The more she thought about it, the more paranoid she became. She tried to piece together the entire evening, going over every little detail. She replayed the conversations in her head, analyzing his every word, trying to figure out if there had been any obvious red flags she'd missed. But nothing added up. There was nothing overtly strange about Chris during the date, except for his vagueness. And then came the final blow. Determined to find out more, Emily decided to call the restaurant to check on the reservation. Maybe Chris had used his real name to book the table, and that would give her some answers. But when she spoke to the hostess, her blood ran cold. There was no reservation under the name Chris. In fact, there was no reservation at all for their table that night. The hostess confirmed that they had seated them as walk-ins. Emily's heart pounded in her chest. How had Chris gotten them a table at a packed restaurant without a reservation? And why had he lied about it? Over the next few days, Emily became more and more paranoid. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every time her phone buzzed, her heart would race, thinking it might be Chris with some kind of explanation. But the calls and texts never came. It was like he had completely disappeared off the face of the earth. Then about a week later, things got even weirder. Emily was at a friend's birthday party, doing her best to forget about the whole situation. She was chatting with some mutual friends when she overheard someone else talking about their own Tinder date. The girl, someone Emily had met once or twice, was describing her recent date, how she'd matched with this super charming guy who seemed too good to be true. As Emily listened, her stomach dropped. The description of the guy, it was Chris. The girl went on explaining how everything had seemed perfect at first. But then, just like with Emily, the guy had disappeared after the date. No calls, no texts, no online profile. He had ghosted her, leaving her with that same uneasy feeling Emily had been dealing with all week. Emily's blood ran cold. This wasn't just some random fluke. Chris, or whoever he was, had done this to more than one person. It was then that Emily realized just how serious the situation might be. What if this guy wasn't just some regular Tinder ghoster? What if he was doing something far more sinister? Why was he creating fake profiles, going on dates, and then disappearing without a trace? But here's the creepiest part. After Emily's encounter, she learned that she wasn't the only one. There were other stories, other girls who had met men like Chris, guys who seemed perfect at first, but who vanished into thin air after the date. And the scariest part? No one ever figured out what they were really after. After that night at her friend's party, where she overheard another girl talking about a similar experience with a guy that sounded exactly like Chris, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something far worse was going on. This wasn't just some guy ghosting a few girls. This felt intentional. It felt dangerous. The next few days, Emily became obsessed with finding out more. She couldn't focus on anything else. Her work started to slip, and she found herself lying awake at night, replaying the date in her head, wondering how she had let herself get fooled. She wasn't some naive teenager. She had been in relationships before, but something about Chris had slipped right under her radar. And the first thing she did was reach out to the girl from the party. Let's call her Sarah. Emily felt a strange sense of relief knowing she wasn't the only one this had happened to, but when she called Sarah, that relief quickly turned to dread. The two of them compared their stories in detail. Same pattern. Chris had been charming, perfect even, right up until the date ended. Then he disappeared, wiping all traces of himself from Tinder and social media. And Sarah had also tried to track him down, with no luck. But here's where it got weirder. Sarah had been contacted by another girl. This third girl had gone through the exact same thing. She too had matched with Chris, gone on a great date, and never heard from him again. Only her date had happened over a year ago. When Emily heard this, her heart dropped. She had assumed Chris was just some creep who ghosted women after dates for whatever reason. But if he had been doing this for over a year, and possibly longer, it wasn't just ghosting. This was planned, deliberate. And the more Emily thought about it, the more uneasy she became. What was his endgame? Was he simply getting off on messing with people? Or was there something darker going on? The fact that no one could find any trace of him, not even an online footprint, only deepened the mystery. At this point, Emily decided to dig deeper. She and Sarah reached out to other women in their social circles, posting discreet messages in Facebook groups and even some local forums, trying to see if anyone else had encountered Chris. And as it turned out, several women had. The stories were eerily similar. Chris had matched with them on Tinder, taken them on dates that ranged from a few months ago to as far back as 2 years. In each case, he used different variations of his name. Sometimes Chris, sometimes Christian, sometimes Christopher. And in every single story, he disappeared completely afterward, deleting his profile and vanishing from their lives. One woman even reported something truly unsettling. After her date with Chris, she thought she had seen him watching her from across the street a few days later. He was just standing there, staring at her apartment, but when she tried to confront him, he disappeared into the crowd. She never saw him again, but the feeling of being watched never left her. Emily's stomach twisted in knots as she read through the accounts, feeling a rising sense of dread. This wasn't just ghosting or weird dating behavior. It felt predatory, calculated, like Chris, or whatever his real name was, had been manipulating and stalking these women. But why? Emily didn't know what to do with all of this information. Was there a way to stop him? Should they go to the police? But then again, what would they say? There was no proof, no evidence, and none of them had been physically harmed. What if the police just brushed it off as some paranoid Tinder drama? But still, Emily couldn't let it go. The turn in the investigation. Determined to dig deeper, Emily decided to search for Chris on other parts of the internet. Regular social media searches hadn't worked, so she went somewhere darker, the deep web. Now, she wasn't an expert in the dark web by any means, but after reading about it and hearing about people tracking down criminals in hidden forums, she figured it was worth a shot. She downloaded Tor, the anonymous browser, and started searching. At first, she was overwhelmed. The dark web was far more unsettling than she expected. Forums full of illegal activity, strange conspiracies, and sketchy marketplaces dominated the landscape. Emily was about to give up when she stumbled onto a particular thread in a hidden forum, a discussion about men who use dating apps to track and manipulate women. Emily felt her heart race as she scrolled through the thread. Most of it seemed like exaggerated claims, but one user stood out. He talked about a man who used multiple aliases on Tinder to meet women, charm them, and then disappear, leaving no trace. The user claimed that this man had been doing it for years across multiple cities. And the username of the man in question? Chris A. 1987. Emily's blood ran cold. She read further, her hands trembling. The user claimed that Chris wasn't just ghosting these women for fun. He was collecting information on them. He had access to their personal details, their addresses, their workplaces. Apparently, this had been going on for years and the authorities had no idea. But what was he doing with this information? The user implied that Chris was selling it, that he was part of a larger operation, using dating apps as a front to gather personal data on women and sell it to God knows who on the dark web. Emily felt sick. Could this really be true? Could Chris have been playing her and all these other women for something far worse than just emotional manipulation? The thought that she had been part of some twisted scheme sent chills down her spine. Emily reached out to Sarah immediately, telling her everything she had found. They both agreed it was time to go to the police. Even if they didn't have much solid evidence, they couldn't ignore the fact that this man, whoever he was, had been systematically targeting women for years. The police had to know something, right? But when they tried to file a report, it didn't go the way they hoped. The officers listened, but without concrete evidence, they couldn't do much. It was all just speculation. An online ghost, a mysterious man with no digital footprint. And besides, no one had been physically harmed. The police took their statements but left Emily and Sarah with little hope. Feeling more helpless than ever, Emily retreated into herself. She stopped going out, stopped using Tinder, stopped everything. Every time her phone buzzed, she felt a spike of anxiety. Every unfamiliar car on her street made her heart race. The thought that Chris, or whatever his real name was, might still be out there, watching, sent waves of paranoia through her daily life. She started checking her windows before bed, locking her doors twice, constantly looking over her shoulder. And then, one night, it got worse. Emily was sitting at home scrolling through Netflix, trying to distract herself when her phone buzzed. It was a text message from an unknown number. At first, she thought it was spam, but when she opened it, her stomach dropped. Still thinking about me? No name, no context, but she knew exactly who it was from. She immediately blocked the number, her hands shaking. She checked all the locks on her doors and windows, her mind racing. He was still out there. He still had her number, her information, and he wasn't done playing with her. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Emily barely slept, constantly checking her phone, wondering if he would try to contact her again. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the messages stopped. No more strange texts, no more odd phone calls, but the fear stayed. Emily eventually moved away, leaving the city behind, trying to start fresh. But even in her new life, she couldn't shake the feeling that Chris, or whatever his name was still out there, watching, waiting. She never heard from him again, but the damage was done. The emotional scars, the fear, the paranoia, they stayed with her long after she left Tinder behind. Sarah, she moved on too, but every now and then, they'd talk, wondering if any new stories about Chris had surfaced. Occasionally, they'd hear whispers, another girl with a similar experience, but nothing ever concrete. The man who didn't exist had left a trail of confusion, fear, and mystery. To this day, Emily still doesn't know who Chris really was or what he wanted, and maybe she never will. And that's where things stand, folks. A man with no real identity, a trail of women left confused and scared, and still no answers. If you've ever had a creepy or unsettling online dating experience, let us know in the comments below. And as always, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more chilling content. Stay safe out there, especially when you're swiping.